Hello everybody and welcome to this video tutorial in which I will show you the process you could use to create a photorealistic rendering of this Braun KS20 coffee maker with the external render engine Thea Render. The target audience for this video are those who are new to digital rendering or would like to fine-tune their techniques and process how to achieve very good looking professional product renderings. To illustrate the steps you can take to turn a computer model like on the right into a nice looking rendering on the left, we'll make use of an actual product photo. I found that when you're new to digital rendering, it's very difficult to understand what you have to do so it looks realistic. The biggest problem is that probably you will try to work based on your imagination or how you think a material looks like. If you have an actual photo or a material or part, you get a definite answer to the way how it has to look like. So the huge takeaways from this photo is first, well, we can see how, for example, this object was framed. So camera position, what height, how it looks onto the object. But much more important, it gives you a clear answer to how does, for example, the orange plastic look like? What's the color? How clear or sharp are the reflections? If we compare this to the black plastic, you can see that the reflections are more diffused, meaning that there's actually some sort of a three-dimensional structure to enhance grip, obviously. And because we have a three-dimensional structure, the reflection can't be clear. It also gives us an answer about maybe the way how glass will look when we have like a bright background. How does metal look realistic? And one of the most important parts and takeaways from this photo is how did they create all the different lights? So we see here we have a left, a top, and a right light. And in the light reflections, we can also see the strength. So this photo tells us the amount of lights, probably the position of the lights, and the strength of the lights themselves. So by simply extracting those key understandings out of a reference photo, we can apply that to our digital rendering studio environment, and you will see that with few steps we get already to a digital rendering that looks very similar to this photo. What I, as an industrial designer, really like about Thea Render is that it is like a digital photo studio for me. So I can easily load in my geometry. I have access to a very powerful but easy to use material system that breaks materials down based on, for example, it's glossy or diffuse or it has a coating on top, but giving you access to all the technical fine-tuning to a very logical and physically self-explaining process. You also can add multiple cameras and multiple lights and lights with different types, for example, point light, spotlight, or area lights to simulate light boxes. So I can work digitally inside the render software very easily, the same way how I would work inside a photo studio. The software has a very low learning curve, and it is also available for OS X and Windows, which is always a plus because when you work with Fusion on different operating systems, you can also have the render engine on each operating system. And to make the process very comfortable sending the data from Fusion to Thea, we can make use of the Thea plugin right inside Fusion. And in addition, what is really great about this is in Thea, while we create our render studio set, if you want to see it this way, we can always refresh individual parts we changed actually inside Fusion inside our Thea render scene. So that's actually a really nice feature because I, for example, utilize rendering and modeling at the same time. And it can always be that maybe at one point later you change part of the design, and then inside the render studio file, you only want to adjust or refresh, basically swap out that part of the geometry, and you don't want to have to start from the beginning. And with the refresh function, we simply swap out the mesh, but material definitions, etc., we created in Thea all remained the same. So it's basically a mouse click and you have everything updated. To send the design to Thea, we can simply click this Thea button, and then you will get the export dialog. Here you can specify the meshing quality. So that means that this NURBS or solid model in Fusion will be tessellated into a fitting polygon model, and that will be sent to Thea. In my experience, normal most of the time works out really well. High is more necessary when you do close-ups or you have very fine details. You also can specify the Z or Y orientation. In my preferences, I have Fusion set to use the Z axis up. So for the exporter, I have to use Y. Add ground plane, enable HRI, we can all turn off. Export only selected. At the moment we don't want, because we want to export everything, and then we can start Thea right after the export by having this one checked. And we can click OK. And the computer model was generated and sent to Thea. If we now go to Thea, you will see there is our coffee maker, and also axis or orientation wise it is correct. Just to go back to Fusion for a moment, for those who do not know about the orientation change, when you go to preferences, here you can switch between Y and Z. I prefer to be Z my up direction. That's the way how I have everything set in my other programs, so it's all consistent among all the programs. Okay, so let's go back to Thea. So let me explain to you the different parts of the interface for a moment. Inside the workspace, we have our 3D view. We can navigate that 3D view by, for example, pressing and holding the middle mouse button on the scroll wheel, and we can rotate our view. By scrolling forward and backwards with the mouse wheel, we can zoom in or zoom out, and with the right mouse button we can pan around. Up here we have certain tools also for specifically to rotate, pan, etc. Undo and redo. We have, for example, move, rotate, and scale, delete, and we have a layer system. We have here, for example, the ability to turn on the transformation panel as an overlay. Here, for example, we can create new cameras and different light types. On the right side in settings, we have, for example, the material tab. Here all the materials and all the properties will be displayed. We have an environment tab where we could specify the type of background environment and illumination we will use. We have an interactive part where we could set up the render engine and render technique we will use. Down here we will be able to load different folders. For example, currently you will see I have only the diffuse materials loaded, but there are also folders for geometry primitives or plastic materials and such. And on the left side, you will see something very similar to the browser in Fusion, where it lists all the different parts. For example, here the models, the light, cameras, and the materials. And down here, whenever, for example, we click an object, it will give you some of the basic properties. such as it show up in the rendering, it should cast or receive a shadow, it should be not visible, and obviously also settings for position, rotation, and such. And you notice the moment I clicked actually this object, this material was loaded, and inside the material preview you will see how that material was loaded in there. If, for example, I click the glass body, you will see now there you see glass. If, for example, I click this metal part here, it will load the metal part. And here, that's the plastic one. So there's a preview of the plastic. So you see the basic properties from the materials we created in Fusion are also carried over into Thea. But obviously we want to fine-tune the materials right inside Thea. So what you want to work on first is the scene, the materials, and then the lights. Why this order? The answer is very simple. One of the most common mistakes beginners do is they create an object, add glossy materials, do a test rendering because I want to see how this material looks like, and then it looks kind of bland. And the main reason for that is simply if you have a reflective surface, it needs to have something inside your scene to reflect. And that's why I stress first scene, objects, mesh lights, etc., and then actually materials for my object. So we need a backdrop. Let's go back to Fusion, and you see that out of a sketch and then a patch extrusion, I created a nice backdrop. Key here really is to have a nice and soft change. At the end it become a little bit more flat, but this band should be nice and big so that to the depth it slightly rises up, so you get a nice gradient in your background. As you can see, the object is also obviously flat below our product. So how do we get this over into Thea now? So we can select this object, and then we will go to refresh geometry. Now that is a function we will use to add more objects to our existing scene, or to refresh the mesh of a part when in Fusion we changed actually the design. So when we click refresh geometry, it asks you about the quality of the triangular mesh. Refresh only selected objects, that is correct, and click OK. Good. Let's go back to Thea, and there's our backdrop. Perfect. Let's give it a medium gray for the moment. Okay, nice. Also one note, when we create materials in Thea and apply to a mesh and we refresh the geometry, only the mesh will be updated. And in Thea it will remain the material we created to it. In terms of lights, Thea offers you the typical point light and spotlight. We can also load IES lights to render really realistic looking light patterns. But I personally prefer to work with mesh lights or area lights simply because they create a very soft and diffuse look. So to create a mesh light in Thea, we can click on this plus inside the browser and then go down to models and primitives, because Thea installed comes already with a basic mesh emitter. So what's the advantage of a mesh emitter compared to an area light? An area light is always rectangular, but everything that is geometry, so mesh, could be turned into a light. So if you have custom light shapes, you could model those and turn it into a light. To add a light, we simply click and drag it into the scene. And we click it, you see inside the material tab, it has kind of like a basic color, and then there's the emitter function. And you will see that when you click on it, you get access to the color of the light and also the power and the energy unit system and other functions. So I would like to scale this one a little bit. So I click on scale, click on the center cube, scale it down, and then I can move it above my object. And I can use the 3D view and also the numeric input to fine-tune the position. And I want this one to be right above my object a little bit, maybe like this. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit. And maybe at this point now we do our first test rendering. With this play button, we start the interactive render engine. With this button, we stop it. And with this button on top, we will tell the software to continue refreshing our view if I change my camera position. Okay, so there you see, there's my object. Renders pretty fast. But when we move the slide up and down, you see there's not much change in the light pattern as we expected. And that is because when we go to interactive, you see that it uses the pasto engine with ambient occlusion turned on. And ambient occlusion, think about it as something that simulates diffuse environmental background lighting. The problem with that is it makes everything a little bit brighter. Where you have gaps or cavities, it darkens it. I personally don't like to use it with digital rendering as much for product design, which is why I will switch to Pasto MC. And then there you see now this is much darker. There's no environmental lighting added to it because we're not using ambient occlusion, and the only light comes directly from my light mesh. And you see, based on the distance of my mesh light to the object, the further away, the less illuminated, the closer, the more illuminated. So that's rule number one. Distance is really important because over distance, the light energy decreases. The second thing that's important with mesh lights or area lights is the size of the surface. You see, the smaller, the more focused that amount of light energy is emitted over the small area, and the sharper the shadows will be. And the bigger the mesh light, the more this energy is spread over a bigger area, so the more diffuse and the softer the shadows will be. And there's really no big rule about how big this mesh light should be. In contrast to here, obviously it should be a little bit bigger, but it shouldn't really be too big. Maybe something like this is good. And I would always judge the size of the mesh light or area light based on the quality of your drop shadows. Okay, so this is our top light. Let's rename it. So in the model section, I will call this one top. And in materials, also there, I will call this one top. So I have a separate light emitting material for my top mesh. Good. I need another area light. So I drag in another one there. And maybe move it into the position. This, for example, we can scale down as well. I make this actually a little bit more narrow, and then I would like to rotate this one. The blue arrow, that's kind of like, we will see how it emits light or not, because these lights emit light only into one direction. Here now I can center it along the x-axis or onto the y, and I would like it to be slightly above the ground. So this is, for example, let's say emit left. We will do the same here, emit left. And then let's take a look at the light. Yeah, it emits actually the light to the opposite side. So this object I have to rotate 180 degrees. So maybe 90. Now I can clean all this up. 0, maybe minus 180. Okay, perfect. So based on where this blue arrow points to, that's actually the back side. The opposite side is where the light emits to. So you can use that as a rule of thumb. And there now you see the light object. Okay, we need one more light. So I make another mesh light there. Also this one we will scale down there. And then we have to rotate it. So 90. And then we can move this one up. Maybe to move it to the outside. Let's rotate the view a little bit. This is still a little bit too tall. And there. Okay, perfect. I made this a little bit bigger because I would like to show the size maybe in rendering and how it affects actually light-wise our objects. I tried to move it somewhat to the correct part. Okay, perfect. So let's quickly here zoom in. And then let's do rendering. There. This actually already looks pretty fantastic. A very basic backdrop, a black environment, and then 3 nicely sized area lights emitting light onto our object. And you see that it didn't really take much of a setup to get already a nice and good illumination. Maybe at this point now I would like to work a little bit better with my camera. So we have to add another camera. You can actually have multiple cameras inside the shot. So instead of having one camera making a rendering, moving the camera, making a rendering, I for each view add a new camera. So I go to a view outside. And inside here you see camera and current view. So let's say I will be kind of like here. I could also double click this camera. You see I can click and make something active. Maybe zoom in a little bit more. Click on current view, zoom out, and you see there is actually a little camera. So let's go maybe to here. And we zoom in a little bit. And then we say, hey, new camera, right click onto camera. And there's camera 2. Maybe I will double click current view and zoom out. And you see exactly where with current view it created a new camera. And to switch to these different cameras, I can simply then double click. So pretty perfect. It's awesome. So get into the habit of having, when you just freely move around, do this in current view, and then the cameras, those are your fixed positions. But let's say this camera we would like to perfectly center and position onto something. You see there are 2 arrows. When I click this arrow out, what does this mean? So this arrow here, or move manipulator, can move the camera forward and backwards. So you see now I'm closer. And the other arrow here helps you to, for example, change the orientation of the camera. See now it looks up. Even here, if I inside this view now right click and, for example, move the camera down, you will see that what I do in reality is simply move the camera including its target down. So in computer graphics, this part here we call the camera target. We are not limited to having to use a tripod or something. We can simply place a camera and then nicely position our cameras. So maybe I can go to an orthographic view, so I could better, for example, see if my camera is straight horizontally oriented. Maybe let's take a look, and I can zoom out a little bit there, maybe go up a little bit. There, maybe like this. Yeah, there. So let's see, how does this view actually look? Pretty good. You see, with the camera being a little bit lower, I also get better reflections on my metal part, because currently this metal reflects the ground plane. And when I move my camera more closer down, so it will look more or nearly perpendicular onto this metal band, I get my light sources better reflected. And also see here my light source is a little bit off the ground, so I could click here light source right, and for example either through the coordinate system here move it around, or for example I could go into a different view, zoom out a little bit, and then here make sure that it really intersects with the ground plane a little bit. And the main reason why I moved this one down is simply so that inside my reflections I can put the light source as low as possible, and I get a nice ground plane and then the light reflection. I don't have any gap in between, because again the light source is off my outside my canvas, so I don't really see it, but it will show up on my renderings. Okay, so that was basically maybe some simple setups for the camera and basic lights, and maybe repositioning how all those are. Now maybe we should go into the materials. So we can select any part, and we can maybe try to overwrite materials. So let's say what type of materials Fusion have. So we can click the plus icon and go to maybe we have diffuse, emitters, metal. Let's see, what do we have for metal? With this one we can change, by the way, also the icon size, so it's easier to read. Let's say those we would like to make, let's say stainless steel. We can just drag and drop them onto it, and there. Now we have to turn on the refresh function for the rendering, or aluminum, gold. I see this is actually a very easy process. Now let's say we go with stainless steel. Okay. So this I would like to make a black plastic, but not as diffused. Sorry, not diffused. It should have a stronger reflection, but not be as blurry. So let's make a new folder. Let's say we go to, let's say materials. That's the bigger overview. So let's say, where do we have basic plastic is here. We have metallic paints, highly reflective surfaces. So let's say basic plastic, and then we have a basic plastic here, reflective plastic. Let's say we drag this one onto there. And where do we have our there? From there I can also drag, for example, it all to there. Perfect. So there you see the reflection is very, very clean. So if I zoom in here, now I can see it nice and crisp, too crisp. Let's say I would like to overwrite the glossiness, so it should be more blurred. So I click the object, go to the material, go not to scatter, which actually defines the color of the reflection. We'll go to structure, and here for roughness we can say maybe 10. Let's take a look, and there already you see how it starts to blur the reflection. If we go maybe 100, it gets very diffuse, so you have to be careful with the steps you use. 20, pretty strong. What about 5? Yeah, it's still too strong. 15. Yeah, let's say something like 15. That's good for the moment. What about the glass? Do we like the glass? That doesn't look too bad actually. Maybe this is a little bit too bluish, so we can click on the color and then adjust maybe the value. Maybe we just make it more white, or maybe a tiny tint gray. The problem with glass is sometimes, well, it is transparent. Sometimes it's difficult to show transparent objects because they're nearly invisible. So what will help here in this rendering to show that something is glass is simply the reflection on it. Okay, not too bad. The plastic is missing. So we can select this orange plastic. So this is a basic material. Could go to the structure. Let's take a look. And there we see we have a roughness of 12.25. This is maybe too much. Maybe, let's say 2. Now if we set this to 0, this means like it's a perfectly polished material, and even in real life we don't have structures that super smooth with plastic. So I would be a little bit careful about it and adding a little bit of roughness, not too much, just a tiny bit, to give those reflections a nice blurry effect. Okay, I'm not sure if I like the metal. This seems way too clean. Let's go back to metals. There are some other structures. What about the brushed one? Let's take a look how this one works. Yeah, that's actually better. Yeah. The problem is if metal is too, or the reflection is too clean, you really stare at it. So there I would always try to see, do you have a reference material, maybe, let's say in this case, a coffee can at home, maybe with a camera, take a photo, take a look at it, study it, so you get a real understanding of how something actually has to look like. And if we let this render a little bit, you will see that it starts to look pretty nice. Maybe this left light has to be a little bit stronger. So let's go to emission. What about 700? What about actually maybe 1,000? And let's compare this to our reference photo. So there we can see now that in my image, this starts to be too illuminated. The right side is getting to there, but this seems to get way too much light now. So we can either maybe move this a little bit further away, so it does not get as strong illumination on it, but the reflection shows the strong light source. So if, for example, we set this one aggressively down to 10, you will see there's hardly any light coming from the left side, and also the reflection is much softer. So maybe let's go with 800. And I really play with these values. I don't want to say in an artistic way, but more in a way so that the rendering looks good. You can use, for example, in a photo as a reference, but in product representation, it's also about the storytelling. So how do you want your part to look like? So you can, I don't know, how could I say that? I don't want to say bend reality, but the goal is not necessarily to render it the way how it really will look like. You should render it so it looks real, but also that it looks interesting. So what else can we maybe do and learn from the photo? I see that there are tiny reflections here and there along the rim. That actually really helps to pop out or to contrast the main product from the backdrop. So let's see how we could do this. So there needs to be some sort of a light. Okay, let's maybe try this one out. First, what I will do, maybe this backdrop artificially I scale down. There. And then maybe I will use this one and then copy and paste, make a copy and move it to somewhere else. And the main reason for that is I'm curious how this actually maybe could work. There, and let's zoom in a little bit and let's do a rendering. Ah, see, perfect. So the backdrop has to be at least so wide that it covers our image, but then we can in the background add another light source that then will show up on the rendering. However, you can see that this light source is very bright in the reflection. This is actually weaker, and that is because this is kind of like a gazing angle. So there's a Fresnel function working. Everything that's perpendicular to the surface is less reflective, and the more we go to the edge, so the more you look at a tangent angle onto that surface, the reflection will get stronger. You perfectly can observe it actually up here, how you have a really nice bright highlight or edge on the light reflection. So this means that this light actually is a tick too strong. So the problem is if we create a new if we change the light source for this, we also adjust by accident the light for this left emitting. So we call this maybe, let's say, this is actually right. Yeah, okay. So we have to just create a new material. So this object, first maybe I move a little bit further away. And then here we could say new material. Or we could, for example, take the left and say, can we make a copy? Yeah, we can make a copy. Yeah, we'll do it easily this way. And then this, we just drag onto that part. So this is maybe emitting left background. So now this light I can tone down. So for example here, and we can do the same, or I can use this one, copy and paste, because actually in this case, yeah, this makes sense because I want the light source or the reflection on each side more or less to be exactly the same at that gazing angle. Let's rotate this one correctly. Okay, good. And then we can, for example, take a quick look. How does this one work out? Yeah, and because these two light sources use the same material, if I now change this material one time, it should actually update on each object, and as you can see, it does. So let's make a quick comparison. Yeah, this is rather soft, so this is pretty good. Okay, let's see maybe how far can we make this one wider so it covers our backdrop perfectly. Yeah, good. Is the empty background, so outside the backdrop, reflected anywhere? It does not. So I think we're in a pretty safe position here. And then based on also, this is currently a white format, but the rendering properly we will do is more a portrait, not a landscape. So this area here doesn't concern me as much. Perfect. So there we have some main lights and then additional lights in the background far away that will help to create those extra reflections on the edges to pop them out a little bit more. Maybe 100 is not enough. I think maybe 300. Yeah, okay. And the closer, for example, this object will be to the front, I move this one to there, then the more it will show up inside, inside the rendering. And there you see now this is actually more on the side, less really at the angle, so I pushed this over a little bit too far. Well, which is why that should be maybe here, or that could be closer, but then they have to be more further away to the site. Okay, so I would say maybe our lighting and material setup for most of this what we have to do we finished, but the backdrop looks a little bit bland. Currently we just have a basic medium gray for the backdrop. Let's take a look at how this looks when we add a white material. Not too bad. The rendering gets much brighter. Let's say we add a black material. It's a nice contrast-rich image. It just has certain issues. What works well is how the metal and the plastic contrast from the background. So it's very easy to read the product shape. On the flip side, the black material doesn't really contrast well actually from the black backdrop, and our glass, because it is transparent, is really hard to read now. If we go with a white backdrop, we can see the backside of this metal ring, which color-wise contrasts well from the backdrop. The highlights on the glass give you the feeling that there is some sort of a reflection going on. Because this is transparent, you start understanding you can see through. Aha, I understand this is actually glass. So this is the way how actually a viewer will read and understand a rendering, which is why you really have to be careful about the backdrop material or color and the light based on also what materials you use. You could, however, obviously also just make a black backdrop and make the whole object black and just only work with the reflections on it, kind of like a mysterious silhouette presentation, kind of like a teaser. You show partially the product, but you don't 100% show it. And then for a more for a rendering that explains more and shows the product, then we simply switch the materials for the product, including the backdrop. However, we're not limited to only use a diffuse material for the backdrop. We can also make it reflective. So when we go to our material lab, we go to scatter. You see here diffuse, that is the material I use for my backdrop. And under reflectance, you see this is kind of like dash, which means it is currently not used. So this is a pure matte surface. But we can make this reflective simply by, for example, clicking in this value slider. This value slider you will see when you click these three bars. And then basically no reflection, and then you see we add reflection to it. So this, for example, specifies the amount of reflection. And you also see down here now part of my coffee maker to show up. We could go to structure and, for example, work with the roughness, maybe to 0, make it nice and clean. However, that never really looks very good because it looks like a glass surface and it kind of is distractive. My eyes just pay attention to this part. I see this product already clearly. I don't need to see the product mirrored upside down in the reflection. That's kind of redundant. So you want to always have a little bit of a blurriness to that glossy reflection, which we can do through the roughness. So the idea is that basically you kind of can sense that there is a reflection on the ground plane, and that helps you to ground the product on the ground plane so it doesn't float, but you don't want the eyes to really focus on it. We spent lots of time building this coffee maker, so you want the viewer to focus on your coffee maker, not on the reflective reflection. Okay, so let's see what else can we do. When we go back to scatter, we have something called index of refraction. And with that, we can, for example, decide how much from a different angle, so switching between a surface that is perpendicular or tangent to the camera, the strength of the reflection changes. To observe the best, I will make a black material. So now you can see the reflection. And let's say this one I set to 1.1. What about 0.1? Okay. What about 10? What about, for example, 2? And you see from 2 to 1.1 it gets softer and softer, or it's softer, so weaker. That basically means that you can describe from, if we take a look at the sphere, how far on the outside to the center, so from tangent to a perpendicular surface, the strength, think about the reflection as an overlay of our diffuse object, will change. So pay attention to the sphere. When I set this to 10, you see the reflection is totally clean and the same strength to the center. If we set this to 1.01, you see it's very, very soft. Only here at the gazing angle that's really strong, and then zip, it falls off. We can actually apply the same also here to the plastic. So let's say we would like to lower the strength of the reflections. There you see no more on the side, it shows up. Or we could say, well, maybe go stronger. So the strength of the reflection we adjust then this way secondarily. So that's something you have to keep in mind. The reflection strength in general with the value slider. And then in addition to that, we can work with the index of refraction or the Fresnel value to describe how over an arced or bent surface the strength of the reflection in addition changes between perpendicular and tangent surfaces. 1.4 is kind of like a good value. And here again, you can work with values that are physically more correct. Or if you want to, we simply overwrite this and maybe are a little bit more artistic. I want the highlights to be more burning, so I change this value a little bit. Okay. What happens if we maybe go to a medium gray? There you see it gets a little bit brighter in general. The reflection on the ground fades further away, so we can, when we switch this to black, and if we switch this to really bright white, you see how the reflection changes in terms of how we can notice it. This rendering is pretty good, but there is a tiny element we can still perfect on it. And that's very important again for the reflections, what you see on your glossy surfaces. If I zoom out a little bit, you will see that my complete environment is pitch black. Now we would only have something like this in case we're really inside a room that has everything sealed off and is painted perfectly black, because those area lights still would also illuminate a little bit my environment, so I would have a little tiny amount of bounce lights, indirect illumination coming back onto my photo scene. And what I will introduce you to now is the environment lighting, and we will use HDRI, so high dynamic range images, for what is called image-based lighting. And we will use those images kind of very softly, gently as a filler. So how could you find quickly HDRI files? So when you go online, you type in free HDRI, you'll find really a lot. Personally, I really started to like the pack by ZBYG. So when you type in free HDRI DeviantArt, you can find his packs. And this is, for example, how this image looks like. Think about it as a horizontal image that is shot kind of like in a panoramic way, and we can take this image and wrap it onto a spherical shape around your scene and then illuminate light onto it. So here you can see what's dark and what's bright, also what has color, and everything that's bright will emit light, everything that's dark, well, obviously doesn't emit light. And you could go to download. If I for a moment go to the folder I have here, there we see, for example, a preview and an HDRI file. Now, when you go online, just as a warning, you find HDRI JPEGs. Do not use JPEGs. We cannot use JPEG for this type of background lighting. You need as a file type to have EXR or HDRI. And the main reason is JPEGs are 8-bit, so they don't have many light colors or tone information in it. And HDRI, which stands for high dynamic range, simply has more color tones, which will turn into finer illumination light tones. I will work with Studio One. That actually seems to look pretty good. This is, for example, here, Studio One. So a backdrop with left and right, two lights and something on top. Okay, so let's go back to Thea. When we go to environment, go to IBL, enable only IBL, click on the folder, and here is Studio, open, and let's do a rendering and see how this works. This is actually very bright right now. So if we rotate our view, there you can see actually the image. So the light sources and the backdrop. So this, why is this important? This actually helps to give more elements to show up in reflections besides just our black environment and our light meshes. But I don't want my whole scene illuminated by this background image, so we can actually go to intensity and, for example, tone this one down 0.1. So now as you can see, my environment is not black anymore. There is actually a small reflection with a kind of like dark studio environment. Maybe let's try a different image. So maybe let's go with this one, because it has some color in it. We rotate to our part here and there. Maybe I will have to go into really low angles so I can better see the environmental reflection on this metal band. So what happens when we turn this one off or on? Maybe we make this one 0.5. Here you can see how this actually turns out to affect our metallic reflections. Maybe one more test, maybe the Studio 15. Okay. We can also rotate, for example, the environment. Here in this image, as you can see, we have mainly kind of like a graphic that looks like light boxes on top. And then we only have a backdrop and just a wall Oh, there's a huge camera. Okay, so the image is actually rotated correctly. Well, we can also rotate this image in the world just with the rotation value here. But with the camera being here as an indicator, that's the way how I think they wanted this to be used. Okay, so now we can just reposition our camera. So I want to go down a little bit more. Okay, perfect, like this. And let's see, 0.1. We go with 1. This is maybe a little bit too bright, I feel. Maybe 0.25. Well, it's just up to your taste with what value you would like to work with. Perfect. So now I think it's time to do an actual rendering. So first I would like to set my camera correctly. So here's my camera. If I go to properties, there now I can see my format. So currently it is like a landscape. What about we set this one to a portrait? There. My product is much better framed. I also don't see all the other stuff. So you see I didn't need to be concerned about that my backdrop isn't wide enough. I have my rendering to set only to the camera frame. So I can perfectly focus just on developing my shot that I will render out. So what else do we have? Well, perspective, shutter speed. We can work with the focal length. Let's say we make this a 35. Then we zoom in. You will get a stronger perspective distortion. If we set this to a 90, it will look more like a flat object. Personally, I work a lot with 55 or 70. We also have some other settings, depth of field, etc. I will leave those settings out for a different video, or you can also read about them in the manual. These functions explain themselves pretty well. So let's take a look at what we have done here. So this is a viewport, and then we have something called darkroom. So what can we do in the darkroom? I mentioned before something I really like about Thea. It kind of provides you with a digital studio environment. So inside the darkroom, we can set ISO, shutter speed, etc. But we can also turn on CRF, so for camera response. What does that actually mean? So let's turn this one on and maybe select something with a 400, maybe Aqua, Color Futura, View, and hopefully you notice actually what changed. This rendering got now tone mapped, so it will look like it was shot with an actual film. Let's try to take a different, maybe, what about this one? See, this looks a little bit different. It has a stronger, it's a little bit darker, more contrast. What do we have here? Maybe another 400. This is very, very yellowish, for example. So instead of doing a color adjustment inside Photoshop, you can simply see if there is a certain film you like, and then use that already as the color adjustment, tone mapping, because this will even push the rendering closer to looking like it was done with a camera or a film. Because the problem is digital rendering is just all mathematically perfect. It just looks too clean, and then with these tools we can actually add more realism to these renderings because they will look more natural. So if we go back to darkroom, we also have something like sharpness, so we can work with the burn. What does the burn, for example, do? Let's set this to 0. Okay. What happens if we set this to 100? See, it actually works with the highlights. We can also turn on vignette. I have this set to 100, so you easily can see what's going on. If you pay attention to the corners, you see they're slightly darkened. You can adjust the amount, or for example, simply turn it off. Okay, so the darkroom, as you can see, can be used to adjust certain render properties of our interactive viewport. But inside the darkroom, we also develop the final image. So when we go now to production, there we can select the different render engines we would like to use: adaptive, unbiased, or pasto. I personally like working with pasto a lot because I can then make use of my NVIDIA gaming cards, which I bought simply because I can do my rendering on the GPU, which will be much faster than just my CPU alone. So you have multiple brains to do the calculation, which will result into faster renderings. Then with the camera, we set up the size. Okay, we set up the type of render engine. Maybe tracing depth we might have to set to 6. Tracing depth means basically every time when a light ray hits a glass surface, it gets refracted. So this is one depth. So when you have a glass, for example, you have two surfaces. So the outside, the inside, the next inside, and the outside. So sometimes when your reflections look kind of blackish, you don't have enough depth, and then you have to increase them a little bit. We also can do a clay rendering just to get a grayscale image without any materials. I will leave most of these other settings alone because I would like to hit render now. So we can click on the play button here and we get a quick overview. And for example, say render. And then there it is. And it starts the process. And you see everything what we have set up here is applied to it. I think when we turn this one off, you see on the fly, we can, while this image cleans up, turn it on and off, add it to it. So maybe the vignette. There's another vignette added to it. Let's zoom in a little bit. This is a pretty small rendering, but the quality is pretty, as you can see, pretty fantastic. And at this point, maybe I simply click stop because I'm very satisfied with that result. And then I could simply save it. So I click on the save button there and go to my desktop and give it a name. So I clicked stop the rendering, and you might ask yourself, hey, it's not finished yet, how could you stop it? So let me explain to you how this engine actually works. When we go to termination, here we can set a time limit. So we specify a certain time the software can work on the rendering, and then we say stop it, be done. Or we can work with sample limits. So let's set this one to 1 and do a rendering. And that's basically just with one sample. So you see that the way how the software works, it samples and then adds and adds and adds more of this noise pattern to the image till at one point the rendering actually looks nice and clean. So maybe with 10 there we see more, but there's clearly noise visible. So how do you know when all the noise is gone and how many samples do you need? Well, That's the beauty of this engine. If you, for example, don't know it, let's say we could set it to 1000 and just let it render. And then here in ray tracing, you will see where it is currently among the sample limits. So we reached 87, 106, and if we zoom in a little bit more, you can see this gets cleaner and cleaner. The rest looks already pretty good. This area is a little bit noisy, so the engine needs more passes to clean those areas up. And you could essentially set a really high limit and let it cook. And once you like it, then you just go stop and save it. Let's say I have to make 10 of these renderings. The nice thing is maybe I have to observe one rendering to see at what sample limit I got a really good quality. And then where I stopped the rendering, let's say 562 samples, then I can put this one in here and then do all the other renderings exactly with those settings for the sample limit, and know that I will get the renderings done with exactly the same quality I'm looking for. And for example here, this area still has a little bit of noise issue. That's simply because we work with a glass material that's close to the other material. It's quite normal that there's a little bit of noisy issue. But small tip as well, if something goes for the web, well, maybe you want to render it out clean. If it goes to print, some minor noise you might actually not see when you print. And also think about these are digital renderings. The problem is always they look a little bit artificial. So having a little bit of noise in it, not too strong, just a little bit of noise, can also work like the film grain. Now in Photoshop we would add actually this grain via a filter, and here we can simply simulate it by a too low sample limit value. And this is basically how you use the darkroom and the engine and the different settings to render out your final image in a nutshell. So this roughly explains the process you have to take when your goal is to create a rendering that looks like it was done inside the studio with a camera. So you use a camera film, you put a camera accordingly into the scene, you create a backdrop your product sits on, and then we add the area lights or emission lights at strategically smart positions to nicely paint highlight reflections all over object so that the viewer nicely can understand and read the shape, the three-dimensional quality of our product. The only problem I would have with this rendering is in case I would like to composite it onto a white backdrop, let's say a white page. Because currently my backdrop has a color, it's not transparent. So what I ideally want is a white transparent backdrop with a transparent drop shadow. So we can go to the viewport and select my backdrop, and then I say don't enable, and also please don't be visible. And actually I will do the same to those area lights. Okay, good. Then we will insert an infinite plane. Infinite plane means, well, it is huge. It covers the complete background. If we then turn on a rendering, you see my backdrop is gone, my area lights are gone, my rendering is rather dull because I would have to go to environment, intensity for my image-based lighting, and increase the energy. Okay, good. Maybe 1.5, or what about 2? Maybe 2. So there you see that that image is used to completely illuminate softly my scene. But you still can see that infinite plane in the background. Now we go to material with the infinite plane selected. We can go to general after we clicked on general here, and then go to shadow catcher and turn this one on. And the moment I turn this one on, you will see the material gets transparent, and wherever you have a drop shadow, you will see that drop shadow. But it also means that maybe based on what it shows in the reflection in the front, actually, because the ground plane is transparent, the image we use for the image-based lighting will show up in the rendering. And this is kind of like how Keyshot works right now. So you have an infinite plane, shadow catcher, and then you work with an environmental image. This is very easy and can quickly be done and set up, but the problem is you're kind of limited to the way how the HDRI file looks like. You don't really have much control over designing or influencing your reflections. So let's say we select a different background image, maybe Studio 5. Let's take a look. It's also not too bad, but it's pretty brightly illuminated. Let's maybe go to 1, so it's a little bit duller. Okay, but yeah, something is just simply missing. It is essentially too uniform. So what I would propose is to, if you want to do something like this, still actually make use of your mesh lights. So we use the environment to illuminate our scene. We use the emitters to create the highlights actually on our object. And then the ground plane we will create with an infinite plane and the shadow catcher. And the only thing we have left maybe to figure out is how could we make the background nice and white. So when we go back to environment, we also have background mapping. And a simple trick would be to simply select, I did a 500 by 500 pixel white image. Then we can load this into the background. So now the image-based lighting does not show up in the background anymore. It's actually overwritten. So this will show up for the light, but then this will show up for how could I say that? The reflection. And when we set this to 0, this is kind of black. If we set this to 2, we make it artificially really bright, so we wash out any gradation we might have. I think currently, yeah, I had the vignette still turned on. I want to have nice and clean corners. And there you can see based on how you set this one up, there we get a little bit of the drop shadow. So what happens if we maybe set this to 0? I'm just curious. That's what we have, 0.1. There it's a little bit darker. So maybe 0.2. So now we bring back some background lighting. Maybe zoom in the camera a little bit more. Rotate the view better. Yeah. And now we created the same rendering, we created a rendering with the same object, just with a white background and kind of like transparent shadows. And in addition to the shadow catcher, catching reflection, we can also select the infinite plane, go to materials, then we go to scatter. And for example, for reflectance, we simply say be reflective. maybe index reflection we turn up, and then it will also show a little bit of a reflection on the ground plane. Obviously, currently the shadow and the reflection with the way how I have set up my scene seems like it's being washed out more or less. So you see, if I turn my environment off, you can actually see the reflection. So it is actually there. Just because of how bright my scene is, I simply burn it out. So this basically explains you the process, how then we also can utilize area lights and background light, including a background fill texture to make this all white, and then a ground plane with a shadow catcher. So we could render out an image where the product is on a white background, including a small noticeable drop shadow and then a small reflection. For everybody who is familiar with rendering images in passes or channels out, so you could compose those in Photoshop, I will show you now how we can activate kind of like a mask and a shadow and reflectivity pass inside Thea. First, I will select the ground plane and say this is mask index 1. And then unfortunately I have to select all the other objects and tell them they should be mask 2. And this one, oops, not 3, 2. And for those who are new to this, the main reason behind what you can do now is you can render out the image like a color image. But then you can also render out additional images that will turn into, let's say, a black and white masks, which we can use then in Photoshop to clip certain parts out. These feet are a little bit tricky to select. Let's see where they are. No, not there. There. So this should be mask 2 as well. Perfect. Good. Then let's go to darkroom. Let's go to environment. We go to production. We have pesto selected. Then we go to channels. And then here you can turn on a mask, alpha, shadow, reflection, etc. And let's render this out into a new image. So obviously you can only see these channels once you made an image, because Fusion has to generate them for you first. And at around 300 I will stop, because I don't want to spend the time to render this cleanly. I just would like to show you the process. Okay, now we have roughly 300, and now we can stop this. Okay, so this is my image pass. I could save this one. Let's say brown color. Okay. I could also, for example, render this alpha image out. And with the alpha here, you see there's my backdrop and my product, and the background where I have no geometry is black. So this would be transparent, but this doesn't really help us a lot. And that's why I, for example, created the masks. Actually, I forgot to set the internal surface, but we can paint this inside the mask in Photoshop. Here's, for example, the mask for the ground plane. So let's say here, mask 1. That one I would like to save, brown mask 1. Okay, let's take a look at what we have with shadow. So this is, for example, a complete shadow pass, just a grayscale image. This object you can see because actually it is colored by the shadows on it. And then let's say, for example, a reflection pass. So now in Photoshop, I drag in my color pass. You can see the background is transparent, the rest is not. I can drag in my mask, press enter, place it. And in this layer, I will use the color range tool. Click on white to select all the white pixels. Click OK. Zoom in a little bit because with shift and left mouse button, I want to include those parts as well. And then with this selection, I can go to my original layer and say, please create a clipping mask. Perfect. And now you see this object got cut out. We can create another layer to fill it with white to simulate maybe how it will look on a white page. Obviously, as you can see, this is kind of grayish, so you have to be careful about how you fill your background during the rendering, because we cannot adjust this in Photoshop as easily. But you see there is no drop shadow now. So number one problem I very often see is they use the airbrush tool and just fake a drop shadow, and that honestly never looks good. A better process would be now to make a duplication of this layer. So the top one always will be our cutout product, and then with the element below there inside this alpha mask we will paint a little bit with white. Yeah, so maybe turn on the white background so we can actually see the drop shadow. I'm currently using a mouse. Obviously for this task you want to use like a Wacom tablet or something. Maybe let's feather this out a little bit more. There. Okay, so now it's like, whoa, I'm painting over my bottle, but that's the layer below because I have this other layer still on top. So this way I can easily paint in one mask and have another object, another layer with the same object on top with a different mask, and then this way I can compose my product shot over a transparent and minimalized but perspectively correct drop shadow, and we can put this all onto a white background. I hope that this video gave you a good overview about the process to export the data from Fusion to Thea, and then how to design your scene. And if we now compare what we did, this is our reference photo, and within few steps we created renderings that obviously are not 100% the same, but they're already, with those few steps, pretty close. So everything that's left is some color adjustments and fine-tuning more a little bit the materials, the light positions, the light strength. And then after some more work, we will actually get to a result that is pretty close to this photo.